from an innovation perspective, the innovation occurs everywhere within the network. It's a tightly integrated ecosystem. It requires upgrades to the network infrastructure, to the technologies that run over the network, which are related to that, as well as what's going on the edge. And to try to separate the two is not an innovation issue. It becomes an economic issue or a regulatory intervention. And then you have to debate whether or not that's doing more harm than good. But the conclusion that no innovation happens on the network isn't supported by technology or history. So the wireless networks are a good example of that because they've been going through a very rapid evolution over the last 10 years. So they upgraded from 2G to 3G technologies. Those technologies have had multiple iterations and versions. And now they're upgrading to LTE. There was an interim WiMAX step for one company there, and now to LTE. These are innovations happening within the network itself. These innovations have now enabled new types of applications to happen over wireless networks on the edge, but that would not have been possible without the upgrades in the networks themselves. And so encouraging, that's what I meant about it's an integrated ecosystem, and the innovation is incremental both within the network and on the edge and interrelated. If there had been no innovation within the core wireless network itself, some of the new applications that are happening on the edge would not have even been possible. And I still think we've just scratched the surface of that. I think there are a lot of applications and new business models yet to be enabled by 4G, and that we need more investment in that network aspect going forward. The problem that can happen is if when you provide disincentives to those types of upgrades, you're ultimately going to curb what's possible on the edge as well. There's the movement that we had over the last 10 to 20 years to sort of move towards a more market-oriented system as the IP-based technology started to break down previous distinctions among networks. But we haven't made it all the way. So today we have we're at a halfway inflection point. I think that the success of the wireless networks, the fact that we have a cable network and an incumbent telephone network in virtually every area, and also additional competitors with satellite video programming. You've got WISPs that provide internet. You have cable overbuilders and the like. I think that goes a long way towards just proving the traditional notion of, quote, natural, unquote, monopoly, that it was really a state-driven monopoly rather than a natural monopoly. Once regulatory barriers were reduced, and as I said, I think we're only halfway there. There are still far too many regulatory barriers out there. But once they were reduced and entrepreneurs and network operators were allowed to capture the benefits of their innovations, they had every incentive to go forth and implement those. And so we saw a ton of investment, enhanced competition, add better networks. The alternative sort of narrative that is proposed by those who would like to go backwards is that, well, when there was a mandatory open access regime for the dial-up internet, we had 1,000 flowers bloom with many multiple ISPs that consumers could choose from in any given market. And so they would argue, look how much more competitive the market was then. There are two problems with that narrative, and there's a reason why I don't think it's the right one. Yes, there were many ISPs to choose from, but they all were providing the same level of network quality because they were all using the same network.
It was all resale, pretty much.
All resale. And the network operator didn't have an incentive to upgrade that network because they couldn't capture any of the upside opportunity from those investments because the ISPs, these resellers, were getting access to the network at regulated rates. So what you had was a lot of consumer choice, but in the DC Circuit's words when they analyzed the similar issue in the UNIP context, in the DC Circuit's terms, it was synthetic competition. When an investor, be they a network operator or in any other industry, when they're allowed to capture the potential returns on their investment, they have an incentive to invest in innovative new technologies and business models to gain a competitive advantage. That's what we did not have when you had a synthetic competition based on a purely regulatory approach. And in contrast, over the last a little over a decade, we have had the type of investment you get when people are seeking a competitive advantage. The idea that somehow turning the internet into a public utility would increase its utility, I simply can't. There's no economic model that supports that. There's no, well, I should say, reasonable economic model that supports that. History doesn't support it. And there's also one more larger concern, which is that unlike electricity, water, or even the roadways, our communications networks fundamentally involve speech. And I think there is a serious First Amendment question if you are going to ask the government to control and own one of the primary conduits of speech, because I think there is an inherent conflict there, and that ultimately could lead us down the road to tyranny. And so for that reason alone, I think as long as there is a willingness for private investment in the networks and they're working well, contemplating turning our communications networks, where all political and every other type of communication occurs, over the government, doesn't sound like a very viable option to me.